In the last episode, AMD, don't fuck this up, okay? You know, AMD, you were this close. This close. Launch day for the RX 9070 series came and went for small, scrappy savior of gaming AMD, pulling itself up by its $163 billion bootstraps, and it told us all that this one is for the gamers, and reminded us that we should be mindful of NVIDIA's challenges during this time for AMD. Well, we've been talking about NVIDIA's challenges for the last 2.5 months. So now it's time to talk about some of AMD's challenges. We tracked sales and sentiment for launch of the 9070 XT and made this map. In green, you can see areas of extreme customer satisfaction with AMD. Major cities in the US did pretty well, far better than NVIDIA. Now, let's look at the dissatisfied area. And so today we're back in the chamber of anguish. You can't say that reviewers live in an echo chamber because I'm literally standing in an anechoic chamber. So, checkmate, viewers. Okay, so it wasn't the smoothest launch for AMD, and because we didn't embark on a 5-hour round-trip road trip, we got to experience internet purchasing firsthand. We buy most of our partner models to review rather than request them these days, and that meant we got to experience the absurd reality of it all. At first, it seemed to go well. We thought we'd gotten multiple orders through at Newegg at 9:08 a.m., 8 minutes after launch, and again at 9:28 a.m. Eastern, which meant that we were up to 30 minutes late, and it still looked like there were tons of options in stock. But just like MSRP, looks can be deceiving. We received these messages from Newegg canceling all of our orders, and it turns out so did literally hundreds of other people. When we tried to buy GPUs at MSRP from Amazon, we were met with this, and this, and also this. So, we did the only rational thing that well-adjusted adults would do. We spent the next 48 hours obsessively compiling and gathering information about prices of video cards to play video games. Only 12 of 51 models that we cataloged across 4 different retailers were at MSRP in the US. Of the remaining 39, 5 were 42% over MSRP, and 16 were 30 to 40% over MSRP, which is worse than we've seen in most prior GPU launches, except for the 50 series. In some ways, it's a normal launch. There's always cards over MSRP. That's just what they do when they add all the bells and whistles. They charge more for them. But what felt so bad about it was just so many cards were so far over MSRP. One thing's for certain, though, it wasn't a paper launch. More like a highly compressed cellulose arboreal composite launch. But Micro Center enjoyers had a different experience. We noticed that this Micro Center had 45% of its total inventory by actual count of cards at MSRP. And that seems like a better distribution of cards at MSRP than what was experienced by those of you who live in a little place allegedly called the rest of the world. I'm told it's a nice place to vacation. Today we're digging through the evidence we've collected to better understand the AMD RX 9070 launch and put some context to the absurdity. This video was brought to you by us. We told you that we made major investments into our hemi-anechoic chamber to improve our acoustic testing quality. But the truth is that we built it to avoid being in an echo chamber. We look forward to your comments telling us how great of a job it's doing and we did for building it. To help fund our in-depth testing and our commentary on the ridiculousness of the computer industry, visit store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our PC building anti-static mod mats with PC wiring pinouts, Ethernet pinout and crimping information, screw tracking grids, and 2-scale diagrams. They're all MSRP because we're the only ones who sell any of it. Our e-waste and Dr. dice and our Snowflake the Cat dice have also been wildly popular. So far, they're selling at about 1-to-1, which GN CEO Snowflake the Cat is deeply displeased about. The Inductor dice contain copper coil inductors within sharp-edge resin tabletop gaming dice that we've actually benchmarked for randomness. The Snowflake dice include a miniature Snowflake the Cat. Both come with integrated roll trays, cards, and wooden boxes. Finally, grab a pack of our 3D coasters with swooping computer case fans and GPU coaster designs. Because if you can't get a GPU at MSRP, at least you could get a coaster that looks like one for the drink you'll need after this launch cycle, which you can consider making in our copper-plated stainless steel mule mugs with thermal conductivity on them. Cheers. And now, I'm going to go to the other set before the voices come back.
mistake.
We prepared this table of RX 9070 XT prices through a combination of crawling through data from Track-a-Lacker and some manual data collection. It shows the card model, retailer, original and updated price, if applicable, how much the price changed, and how much the price is elevated over the base MSRP of $600. Because of the way Amazon aggressively delists and removes prices, anything from Amazon is just what we came across in a spot check the morning of launch. Pricing data may change by the time we publish this due to a fluid market. In fact, we'd expect it, but we're working on what we have here today. The average price of all 9070 XT models, ignoring quantity, is $739, or $139 higher than AMD's base $600 MSRP. Of course, you'd also want to look at this from a volume perspective. We'll do that in a second. We have those numbers too. With all cards included, that makes the average increase over MSRP 23% by model, with non-MSRP occupying a range from 20% over to a terribly bad 42% over, which is completely insane. Do not spend that much more, please, for one of these cards. The bells and whistles are absolutely not worth it. Only 12 of the 51 listings that we cataloged were actually at MSRP. XFX's Mercury 9070 XTs were the worst, with the Magnetic Air OC variant taking in the top spots alongside the Power Color Red Devil Limited Edition at Micro Center. Expressed as an average, XFX's 9070 XT models all combined were 29% over MSRP. Again, quantity notwithstanding for now. The Asus Tough cards fill in next at 33% over MSRP. ASRock generally stayed closest to MSRP, with its cards by model coming to an average of 11% over MSRP. Interestingly, Best Buy and B&H show price reductions across a few listings, all of which had extremely elevated initial prices. The worst was the Asus Tough at B&H for $1,100. You could have gotten a 4080 Super for that money a year ago. That would have been questionable in ways back then, but it would have made more sense than this. Now that later was reduced to $800 on B&H. B&H might be able to argue that these were placeholder prices since it's only selling these GPUs via a waiting list, but we can't know yet. However, Best Buy has less defense. Best Buy's situation was similar, with an initial listing price of $950 with a Gigabyte Aorus Elite later dropped to $760. This may coincide with the limited time quote-unquote deal pricing that we saw from Best Buy initially on launch morning, whose deal text was later removed. Our understanding is that AMD had a conversation with Best Buy after seeing that, causing the retailer to remove what appeared to insinuate that the launch price was a limited time, so that $760 or in some cases $550, $600, and that later it would climb to the higher price. Now we'll move on to the RX 9070 non-XTs. So the MSRP for these is supposed to be $550. We maintain that that's $50 too high. We think they were trying to create an intentional upsell to the 9070 XT, but there's good news. The good news is it's not $550. The bad news is that it's more. The average price of all listings by model, again, absent of quantity right now, is $628, which is $78 higher than the base MSRP of $550, or an average of 14% over. 13 of the 38 cards we gathered info on were at the base MSRP. A better ratio than the XTs, for what that's worth. The average increase, though, over MSRP for all 9070s shown here is again 14%, with the raised price models in a range from 13% at the low end for the Power Color Hellhound at Micro Center, up to the Sapphire Nitro Plus, which you absolutely should not buy, at a 31% increase over base price, also at Micro Center. So they're like for like there. That puts the most expensive 9070 at $720, which is insane. Do not spend that much money on a partner model for a non-XT 9070. Now, it'd be easy for people to say, this is normal. Partners have always charged too much money for some of their higher end models. There is truth in that. And it has likewise always been completely insane to spend that percentage more for something that barely adds any value when we're talking these class of cards. Like, this is supposed to be the modern mid-range. It used to be like a step sort of, it was like the quarter range, but it's that much worse when it's not a true flagship card. And while, yes, this has happened in the past, the data we're sharing today shows that it's gotten worse. Obviously, $720 for a 9070 is atrociously bad. It's actually the same price as the Asus 9070 XT prime OC at Newegg. At those elevated 9070 non-XT prices, you'd be better off buying a used NVIDIA card. In fact, every single 9070 that wasn't MSRP was actually more expensive than MSRP 9070 XTs. That's also insane. And it might be another piece of evidence pointing to AMD dropping the MSRP of both of these GPUs at the last moment. Average increase per board partner is a lot closer for the non-XTs by percentage, to the point that it's not really worthwhile to get into specific numbers. We'll point out Asus, though, as being technically the worst. Overall, adding all of the models for 9070 XTs and 9070s together, the average increase over MSRP is 19%. Now, we haven't collected this data for AMD in the past, so we don't know how normal that is, but we can bring up a frame of reference from our NVIDIA fake prices video. The Asus RTX 4090 Strix, regarded as the most expensive normal 4090, sold for 25% over MSRP. That's a super high-end GPU with a super high-end partner model video card, including a bunch of unnecessary expensive bells and whistles from a company that largely sells its brand image. Tons of these AMD 9070 XTs and some non-XTs are way across that percentage threshold. Again, including some at 42% over MSRP. That's a bigger price hike than the Strix 4090. It's actually approaching pricing territory, use the same example as the NVIDIA fake prices video, as the Kingpin extreme overclocking cards, which were completely unlocked. If you were a normal consumer, you absolutely should not buy. They were fully unlocked for OC. And if you messaged the guy whose name was on the video card, he would help you overclock it by personally responding to your messages. Like, that's the percentage over MSRP. These cards are really close to where the KP cards were. It's crazy, especially considering if you have trouble with one of the Asus models, the level of personal support you get if there's a problem is, fuck you, there's a scratch on the card. So in this case, mid-range GPU price bloat, well, modern mid-range, continues. Even if it's not quite in the range of price bloat that we saw with NVIDIA's 5070 Ti's, for example. According to this detailed product listing sheet from the Dallas Micro Center, which is the only such one we were able to find, we observed 421 out of 920 cards, or roughly 46%, were sold at MSRP. That includes quantity this time, so that's really key here. We're not just talking models now, we're talking units. More specifically, 319 of the 705 9070 XTs and 102 of the 215 9070s were listed with MSRP. This accounts for about 45.25% of the 9070 XTs and nearly 47.5% for the non-XTs. As seen in this chart we've put together, each manufacturer listed had at least one MSRP card for both variants of the GPU. In these listings, excluding MSRP models, percent over MSRP ranged from 12.73% on the low end to 41.67% on the high end. Now, to anchor this in reality, it is normal for partner models to charge more than base MSRP, and that's really important for people who might be newer to the industry to realize. What's different this time is how much more it is and how much worse it feels. And some of that worse it feels stuff, it gets a little more nebulous. It's outside of really the scope of this, where you get into things like broad macroeconomic conditions and things like that. But what we can talk about is the percent upcharge has, broadly speaking, increased for these models. And in fact, the majority of the models sold at that Micro Center location we just pointed to are not base MSRP. And so the reason they charge more than MSRP is extra features they tack on. An extra V-BIOS switch, an LED physical toggle, quieter fans, a better heatsink, Hellstones. You'd expect to pay a lot for those, but you'd be surprised. It's apparently only like 42% more than base MSRP. And those features do add value, but it has never been the case that they add enough value to, unless you're doing competitive XOC or something, to start paying this much more money for them. You'd pay an extra 40 or 50 sometimes for a Strix SKU, like a 1080 Ti Strix non-OC versus baseline. That was 50, it's about $40 extra. This time, though, both companies' partners, NVIDIA and AMD, have totally lost the plot on this. They have run away with the pricing, and AMD in particular, it feels bad because it marketed itself as the savior of gamers. And like they were gonna come into our salvation and bring us all out of the hellscape of NVIDIA's pricing, and they didn't. I mean, they and their partners together failed to do that. We dug back through decade-old reviews from our own publication, Tech Power Up, Tom's Hardware, Anantech, and others. We took prices from launch day of the 1080 Ti and RX 5700 XT GPUs to compare their average price increases for partner models over baseline MSRP. Remember, there are multiple MSRPs technically. There's the base MSRP from AMD or NVIDIA, and then there's the MSRP for each individual model. What we're proving is that the cost increase in partner MSRP over baseline has gotten worse. They've deviated even more from baseline, making it seem even more unrealistic. This is both of them, not just AMD. Here's the goated 1080 Ti. We reviewed a lot of these. As you remember, the 9070 XT had multiple cards at 42% over MSRP. The GTX 1080 Ti Kingpin was the only card at 42% or higher over MSRP, technically about 43%. And that's a specialized XOC card. Those are basically extinct today, meaning cards of that quality don't exist anymore. The next highest is the Lightning Z, which was competing to the KP card and was 24% over MSRP. In fact, most of the cards of that era were about 7% to 10% over MSRP, and those felt pretty good to buy at $750. That includes some of the best ones. The EVGA 1080 Ti FTW3 and the SC2 were both excellent cards. The 1080 Ti Armor was a basic 1080 Ti for MSRP, but could be converted into an excellent water-cooled card with its reference PCB. And again, we pulled these prices from numerous reviews that corroborated them and showed these were the list prices at launch. And that gives us a like-for-like comparison. We're not looking at scalped prices. We are looking at only MSRP to MSRP, and that means partner MSRP. This chart is hugely different from what we just saw in the 9070 and 50 series launches. Partners have gotten out of control. Here's the 5700 XT. The 5700 XT had two prices. The first was $450, but after it debated itself on Twitter, it came down to $400 pre-launch once it gained some clarity. Using the $400 price as the reference, since that was the launch price in post-debate, the increase in price for the cards we found via Tech Power Up and our own prior GN reviews ranged from 3% to 20% increased over MSRP. The $480 Tai Chi OC Plus was among the highest. There are models we didn't list for each, going back pretty far here, but this cross-section gives you cards from all over each stack. We are confident that the data supports the delta against MSRP is increasing with time. That means AMD and NVIDIA share blame with the partners for setting possibly unrealistic price targets as the floor. Only a couple models hit the floor. 1 minute you're on top, the next you're not, you missed your shot. In fact, if you've been following us for at least 6 or 7 years, you might remember that we ran a report where we talked to partners who said they had no intention of keeping MSRP models around of that era after they were sold out. They only existed for launch, but there wasn't enough margin in it for them, they said, for an NVIDIA launch, and so they only did it to satisfy NVIDIA's launch price, and then they intended to only sell the more expensive SKUs later. That might happen here as well. We'll come back to the fake MSRP discussion in a moment. We have more there, but it would help to get an idea for quantity. So we've addressed part of the fake price discussion. Now we're going to talk about the paper launch topic and whether or not this was as much of a paper launch as NVIDIA was. The short answer is no. Micro Center can be sort of a microcosm for this inventory report because Micro Center, it is hyper-localized. Until recently, there was the closest one to us was like 4 or 5 hours away, and this is true in most of the US. It is just one chain, is very local, but it's useful because we can do a like-for-like comparison of it against NVIDIA, and if that extrapolates cleanly across the broad retail ecosystem, it's a useful data point, and we have data for its 50 series launch and this launch so we can get perspective on AMD's. By crawling through web posts and cross-referencing them and looking at photos of the front of Micro Centers that people posted to Reddit, we were able to conclude that Micro Center had nearly 12,000 cards in stock known, excluding a few stores that we couldn't find data for. We think it's probably at or a little above 12,000 with those extra stores. For reference, this spreadsheet circulated on Reddit after users tallied the Micro Center inventories for the 50 series launch day. The Madison Heights and Sterling Heights stores are actually the same, so subtracting those 10 duplicate entries from the 5090s and 91 duplicates from the 5080s, we end up with 223 5090s and a little over 2,300 RTX 5080s for launch day. Overclockers UK also posted some numbers. Gibbo from OC UK posted this, quote, "We do have several deliveries due today and next week, so we might have more available later. We've sold around 5,000 units now. Warehouse is working very hard to get them all shipped out today." And then there's a classic PHPBB style smiley face emoticon. I suppose I should try to quote that too. It's sort of dead in the eyes look smile. Let's see if I can. So that puts us at around 12,000 units for a localized store in the US and 5,000 units for a localized store in the UK. We spoke with insiders to AMD and its partners, and we learned that AMD shipped, quote, tens of thousands, end quote, of units to the North American market alone. And most of those were 9070 XT GPUs. The breakout is more interesting. We don't have the breakout for each store individually of the 9070 versus XT quantities, but we have some of them. Of the 11,657 total tallied, we were able to identify the model of 2,528 of them. The split of these is about 22% 9070 non-XT to 78% 9070 XT. Now this is really interesting because this supports that AMD might not have even wanted to sell, much less make, the 9070. It seems to be a tool to sell 9070 XTs. That is sort of our interpretation of this. It's like a decoy product, like we talked about between the 7900 XT and the XTX before the massive price gulf happened later. So again, AMD with the XT and XTX last time, they were at $900 and $1,000. With that difference just months later becoming around $200, within a year, the difference was sometimes $250. To us, it doesn't really matter why AMD does this. We don't really care that much about the multi-billion-dollar corporations' perspectives on how they price things. What we care about is what does it look like and feel like to a consumer. That's the important part. Now, let's just say, though, that beyond getting upsold, the yields are so good on the 9070 XT GPUs that AMD had to actually fuse off parts, or in other words, make worse a good XT to make quantity for a non-XT in that situation, even if that's the argument, which that's an extreme. You'd think it'd just be a catch for the low failure rate. But even in that extreme situation, it still kind of makes sense as a consumer that, well, then why wouldn't AMD just price the 9070 at $500? If it's only going to exist for the purpose of selling an XT, and there's not going to be a lot of 9070 non-XTs anyway, then an extra $50 cheaper off of base price, and therefore reducing the cost to the partners, which is where AMD itself actually makes money. Remember, they make the money from selling it to the partners. That reduction wouldn't seem to matter that much if it's a lower quantity part anyway, and then they at least get the goodwill and they're able to drop the accessibility of the card to be more affordable. The problem is, though, it's a tool. It seems to be a tool to sell the 9070 XT. And as a tool, is more functional if it's closer in price, because then it feels like you're losing out on too much to get the non-XT. That's how we see it. We next checked with several system integrators. Those are the companies that build pre-built PCs. Yes, some of them do talk to us to ask about AMD's Launch, and their perspective on success is way different from DIY parts retailers. The first SI we spoke to sold 50 systems with 9070 XTs and 20 systems with 9070s on launch day. That SI had just over 1,000 systems with the RX 9070 and RX 9070 XT cards available for purchase. That's 7% of the built systems that sold on launch day. That SI told us that this was, quote, better than expected as compared to AMD's previous launches. For perspective, that same SI told us that they had 20 units of RTX 5090 GPU on launch day and that they sold out in about 2 to 4 minutes. There may have been some wider market influence there as well, so if the 5090s all evaporated from retailers, consumers might then go over to SIs to buy them because the part is so desirable and its price so high. Buying a whole computer might have made more sense for that type of typically DIY buyer going pre-built, as opposed to the 9070s. Another SI told us that they sold 7 units of 100 available on launch day for the 9070 series. Interestingly, that's also 7%. So that's 2 very differently sized system integrators at the same sell-through of inventory. The second SI sold about 30 units of 5090 system on launch day, which was 100% of availability. Although technically they had started with one 5090, they didn't get the rest until later in launch day. So it's really interesting to get the perspective from these 2 system integrators, much different than the DIY market. The first one thought that this launch went better than expected, but only in the context of AMD. The second one felt that this launch was basically a dud. They didn't sell enough. It just felt like it was kind of a non-mover. But the most interesting thing here is that in both situations, for the non-enthusiast, we'll call it average video game enjoyer, they don't buy AMD. Definitely not AMD GPUs from pre-built. AMD has to make inroads there eventually. OEM and SIs, they move the most of the GPUs in the market, so it's really important for them to do that. We think for AMD to do that, it needs unshakable goodwill in the enthusiast and DIY segment, because those are the types of people who become the evangelists, the types of people who work in IT sectors of large corporate entities, and they can become the evangelists just like Ryzen had happen. But between the two SIs we spoke with, one of them ended up with 50.5 times more AMD GPUs than NVIDIA GPUs on launch day for each launch day. Yet NVIDIA left it in sort of a better place in terms of inventory sold. The other received about 100 times more, since they'd only received a single 5090 eventually, but after that, later in launch day, they did get another, I forget, I think it was 27 more or so. So that put it at still 4 to 5 times more depending on where they landed. Using Micro Center only as another control, they received 4 times as many 9000 series cards as 5000 series NVIDIA cards. By all accounts then, this was not a paper launch in the way that the RTX 5000 series was a paper launch. This is much more normal in that there were a lot of cards. It still wasn't enough to sort of satisfy the demand, but the real problem we think is that the amount of cards over MSRP, that's what caused the pain this time specifically. But there is a distinction between the two launches by quantity. AMD objectively had way more GPUs, and by a lot. We're talking about 12,000 GPUs for one retailer against, for the same retailer, 5090 and 5080 together, something like 2400, 2500. Objectively, AMD shipped a lot more units by huge amounts. So it is not a paper launch in the same way that NVIDIA decided to do. Now, the supply wasn't fake, but the question is whether the MSRP was fake. And that's what we can get into now. That's the crux of this. Since it seems AMD panicked when it caught wind of NVIDIA's January announcements and decided not to announce its GPUs in its CES presentation, even though it told the press beforehand, we can continue the speculation that it never planned to sell these cards at these prices. If AMD is subsidizing partners, distributors, and retailers to hit lower than expected pricing, then the new concern becomes whether the announced price is temporary. Now, it would seem, just based on historical pricing of AMD in particular, in fact, it should come down to that price and eventually drop below it, typically faster than we see for NVIDIA. But you never know. It could be this time is different. So we'll go through what we have. Found via video cards, at least 3 distributors have publicly stated that MSRP will only apply to the first shipment of cards. Swedish retailer, we're going to go with inet.se, announced in a machine-translated post, quote, "Prices apply only to the first delivery of the respective model. We have now been told how the recommended prices, so-called MSRP prices, work for the launch of the AMD RX 9070 and 9070 XT. We must not say the exact prices for release, but simply explaining they will be applied to a limited number of cards." The company clarified, quote, "Our second delivery from Power Color is already waiting, and we cannot offer it at MSRP prices. This means that we will first sell the Reaper models at MSRP price, and the stock balance will tick down as usual until the first delivery is sold out. Then, with a certain delay, the stock will be filled with new cards, and we will then release the Reaper cards for order again, but not at the MSRP price." They continued, quote, "If you get through an order with the MSRP price, even if the cards are sold out, we will of course give you that price. But we unfortunately have no opportunities to continue selling cards at MSRP after the first deliveries are sold out," end quote. Retailer OCUK, which is part of the Case King family, affirmed this in its own post. Quote, "MSRP is capped quantity of a few hundred, so price will jump once those are sold through," end quote. Another UK retailer, eBuyer, reportedly canceled pre-orders that were processed at MSRP after it sold out after the first delivery of cards. They explained to an affected customer this, quote, "Unfortunately, we were only allocated a limited number of units at the price offered by AMD, and we won't be receiving any additional stock at this price. As you can imagine, this launch has been extremely popular, and we have now sold out at that price. As a result of this, your pre-order has been canceled and any payments have been reversed," end quote. A separate eBuyer customer claimed to have checked out at £569.99 British pounds, but the price increased to £664.98 when processing his payment. eBuyer repeated its previous statement, explaining the finite number of MSRP cards and adds, quote, "Once these were sold, we did have to sell these at normal costs," as a typo there. This would seem to indicate that it's not simply from something like taxes being added after you've already spent the money. But AMD has responded. AMD emailed the media, including us, a statement from Frank Azor. You might remember AMD's Frank Azor from a previous AMD launch where he bet customers that, unlike their competition, they would have plenty of supply, and that he would bet $10 if in fact they did not have plenty of supply. He lost that bet, by the way. Not sure if he ever paid out. This is like when AMD's other now former executive claimed after seeing NVIDIA's prices for a prior GPU launch that AMD, as part of some grand strategy 6D chess move against NVIDIA, had, quote, jebaited NVIDIA, when in fact what we think happened was AMD, just like this time, saw the NVIDIA prices and fucking panicked. And they dropped them, and then they tried to retcon it into some kind of marketing strategy. And AMD, when you do this shit, you're fucking yourselves over. Stop doing this. It is not, you're gonna get the shirt. The t-shirt will be made. Just stop. AMD continually riles up and plays into this tribalistic mentality of pitting fans of two companies against each other, but then we think it's using NVIDIA as a shield to do the same shit. Anyway, executives in suits taking shots at each other on Twitter because they have nothing better to do aside, AMD emailed us this statement from Frank Azor. Quote, "It is inaccurate that $549, $599 MSRP is launch-only pricing. We expect cards to be available from multiple vendors at $549 and $599, excluding region-specific tariffs and or taxes, based on the work we have done with our AIB partners, and more are coming. At the same time, the AIBs have different premium configurations at higher price points, and those will also continue," end quote. Speaking with insiders, we learned that AMD is continuing to, quote, enable its partners to maintain those prices. Now, we asked, what does that mean to say that AMD is enabling these prices? And the answer we got was that AMD is working to either lower the cost to the partners, just to take a step back and remember the chain here. The way this works is AMD makes the GPU. They buy the GPU, they provide the design to TSMC. TSMC makes the silicon wafer, they dice it, they sell the GPU to AMD, the packaging happens. AMD sells that to its board partners. Board partners get trays of the GPUs and they put them on the PCBs that they make in their own SMT lines or in subcontracted factories. They then sell those either directly or to distributors or large enough retailers, or ship them into Amazon or whatever. That's the chain. AMD just at face value makes its money when it does that first step, sell GPU to partner. So there's a lot that happens after there where AMD has a lot of plausible deniability to say it's one of these guys in the chain. It's the partner, the distributor, the retailer, someone in there is the one that's screwing customers. But AMD also has levers here that it can pull. One of those levers is MDF, or Marketing Development Fund. Another one is rebates, where, and this has happened for both AMD and NVIDIA in the past, they will provide, just like a consumer rebate, a rebate for a purchased product to retroactively bring the price effectively down, or apply it to a future order as a credit, or they can do Marketing Development Fund, which is basically giving the partner money to then spend with YouTubers, with websites, publications, on marketing endeavors, Instagram ads, whatever the case may be. And that is sort of AMD or NVIDIA approved advertising. But the partner gets and spends the money with whoever it is they're advertising with. So that's another lever that they have. But based on the statement they sent to the media, it's still unclear whether cards for MSRP can be expected or not going forward. The statements from distributors and AMD directly contradict one another. AMD can certainly say, quote, launch-only pricing is inaccurate, but the fact of the matter is the sellers that we've previously mentioned have increased the prices. And again, we come back to the consumer doesn't care what AMD's reasoning is. The consumer doesn't care if AMD means its GPU price to the partner has stayed the same, or it has enabled this, if at the end of the day, the consumer is still paying more than what they thought. Now, AMD is partly to blame here because by not offering its own reference models this time, there's not an anchor where the partner's own supplier is competing with them, which has downsides for consumers too. But in this instance, it's an upside, which is that there's not that anchor there to have a fixed price that you can trust the first party's not going to change it. NVIDIA doesn't really screw around with their, I've reached my quota for this one, doesn't really screw around with their FE pricing. Like they launch it, maybe it's not in stock, but they don't really change it. And so AMD doesn't have a reference model, there's no anchor, and partners have even more reason to run wild. And likewise, it means partners can drift from MSRP so much that it becomes kind of unpredictable who has an MSRP model and where you can buy it. Now, on the upside, AMD can avoid an EVGA-like collapse where partners get pissed at it because they get the silicon at cost, like NVIDIA, and they can make it better cooler, or they can sell it for cheaper or whatever, where that's a huge power play for NVIDIA. That's a downside for everybody because it starts to kill the internal competition potentially. It depends on how it's leveraged. So NVIDIA tends to, in our understanding, act fairly vindictively where it can do things like withholding inventory, changing allocation, things that are legal, but you change the allocation between vendors who are playing by the rules you want them to play by. And whether AMD is or isn't doing that, we're not sure. But again, from a consumer perspective, it's expensive. Now, so far, we've talked about the US market primarily, a little bit of the UK in here, but we're based in the US. We're the most familiar with the US market, and what we know from you all posting in the comments is that a lot of you in other countries are getting screwed worse than we might see in the US. So with Micro Center, we had that example of 45% or so were MSRP. It looks like it might have been worse in some other countries. So what we did is we collected reports from 16 different countries outside the US and crawled through them, all sharing similar sentiment of MSRP cards evaporating, and we'll share a few of them here. A user from Europe reported, quote, "In Europe, the MSRP cards were all gone within 2 minutes at most," end quote. One from Australia says, quote, "By the time the page loaded, it was all out of stock," end quote. It says, quote, "Gone within 5 minutes," end quote. A Polish user describes, quote, "Not a single card was MSRP," end quote. And the list goes on. Various users reported Netherlands retailer Megaco continuously increased prices throughout the launch. One user explains, quote, "At 1500, their website crashed, and Megaco kept on raising prices. If I'm correct, they raised the price 3 times in total. Now it costs 1,100 euros for a 9070 XT that has a $600 MSRP," end quote. Another user states, "Bought one from Megaquote for 930 euros. Was sold out 3 seconds later, only to come back fully in stock, but suddenly another 100 euros added," end quote. A third user, as the retailer even increased the 7900 XTX pricing. Now, because we don't have definitive numbers here, we can't make hard claims, but it would appear as if Europe did receive fewer cards than US allocation. Now, this happened with NVIDIA too, unfortunately for those of you in Europe. In South America, we've seen similar reports all over really, but it would appear that excluding OCUK, the volume per retailer was lower than what we saw in US retailers. And specifically, and importantly, stock being sold at MSRP appeared, based on user reports, to be less prevalent. And this is even with new tariffs in the US. All right, so wrapping up, this has been a long process. It's been long enough that my shirt has changed. Amazing. Couple takeaways here. This has, first of all, been eye-opening for us as well, the research process, and it's given me a few ideas for content. So we're gonna do some research pieces over the next few weeks. We'll gather information for it, put something together. Some of the key takeaways that are separate from the launch-specific discussion we've been having. One of them is that it does appear as if the cost increase in partner models has increased, the percentage has increased over time. And so partners are shipping cards at a percent price higher than baseline MSRP that is greater than what they have done historically in the past from what we've looked at briefly so far. And we're going to compile more data on that because it's a pretty interesting topic. And what that might indicate is that launch MSRPs might be for vanity. They might be for show. And if they are for show, and it's a situation where the partners feel so squeezed that it's not just greed, it's survival that they're pricing it like that, and I would come back to that. I'm not saying that's what it is. I think it's greed. But if it's just survival, taking the sort of charitable interpretation, then the MSRP is bullshit. And if the MSRP, and this is both of them, this is NVIDIA and AMD. If the MSRP is bullshit and they're just using it to try and lever goodwill for a low quantity of cards, then obviously it needs to be adjusted. But no one wants to see higher prices. And if some cards hit that MSRP, then for some people, it's real. I mean, you have the Dallas Micro Center numbers where it was like 40-something%. That MSRP was real for those customers. And so it's a really tricky situation. Now, and I don't have an answer for it. But one of the things that may be interesting looking back historically is there was a time when we covered I'm just going to name them now, EVGA. This is one of the reasons they quit. EVGA had a series of cards where I remember learning that they were making $4 per card. So their margin was functionally zero. And those companies then try to make their money off of the various keyboards, power supplies, cases. A lot of these are failed projects for all the board partners. And that's where they try to kind of make the money to survive. Now, if you structure your business on low margin and you have a few things that are high margin, awesome. You're built for low margin. You're going to do pretty well when you sell a power supply at higher margin or a keyboard at whatever, 50, 100%. But the point is that in that era, those cards, I remember speaking with EVGA and learning that, and we didn't fault them for this because they were, $4 as a joke. They did not have any intent to maintain that price. And basically, as soon as NVIDIA gave the go-ahead and said, okay, you can let off the pressure, we've hit MSRP, then they would stop selling that model and go to something a little more expensive. And the intent was, okay, we've endured enough pain to make Papa Jensen happy, and now we can sell things for more money and try to make some of it back. So that's not really bringing it up for any point other than just some historical context of what the GPU market's been like. But it definitely appears to have gotten worse. The tariffs argument is kind of BS because, I mean, you look at other countries outside the US and they're just getting screwed even more. And also, a lot of that inventory hit the US. Remember, it's been stocked, and they've been stockpiling it since before tariffs went into effect. So it's not like, I mean, it's a great cover story, and it will have an effect. But I don't buy it when you look at the total situation for both these vendors over the last two launches now, this one and the 40 series for NVIDIA. And it's a price creep. That's what we're seeing. And everyone's realized they can make more money on these things. They've realized that people will pay for it. And you're getting screwed. That's all it is. And the reason it feels like getting screwed, I think, so much is because of that delta against the advertised baseline MSRP. So even though, yes, technically the partner models have a different MSRP, the higher it goes of a baseline, the more it hurts as a consumer, where you're like, I went into this with expectations of spending $600 and I'm spending $850, man, fuck that. And you can't blame anyone for feeling that way, because even if technically that model is an $850 MSRP, if you went into it with the expectation of spending $250 less, then it just feels like BS. So anyway, that's kind of it for now. This is a really interesting topic. We have a lot more to research on this, and this has opened up some ideas for us. So we're going to put that together, but this is enough for now. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus if you like what you see here and you want to see more of it and support our work, as we are actually majority these days dependent on viewer funding for what we do. That's including the store and Patreon. So that's it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.